Welcome back to the podcast. Before we start this episode, what I wanted to do is really give you an idea about what's coming up in the next few weeks and months on the podcast to give you a bit of visibility on the content. So after today's episode on mental health on the front line with Lucy Gough on trauma's risk management, this week we have trauma series part 4 on spinal trauma with Jim Walmsley, which we're going to record this week as a fresh episode. Then next week we're going to look at tackling alcoholism and how much alcoholism affects both the NHS but also global health services and what can be done about alcoholism. Then we're going to look at pre-hospital burns with Chrissy Stiles. We've got part 1, part 2, and this coincides with National Burns Awareness Day in October, which would be fantastic. And then we're going to look at front of neck access, Sophona, and the salad technique, so suction-assisted laryngoscopy and airway decontamination with Cliff Reed from Sydney Hems. And then we're also going to look at 12 lead ECG algorithms with Professor Peter McFarlane. So he's famous for writing and indeed orchestrating the Glasgow algorithm. And he's the father, really, of ECG algorithms. And then we look at understanding barriers and enablers to supportive teams in UK health systems. So this was a GMC commissioned piece written by a number of lecturers at Hull University that we interview on the podcast. A fantastic piece. Then we look at selecting for high performers with Chris Denny. Chris Denny is the medical director of Northern Rescue in New Zealand. We also look at pre-hospital care homes, or indeed pre-hospital care in care homes with Lance A. Slatton, and just some of the wide, disparate environments that care homes both can cause challenges and indeed some of the areas of good practice within care homes, but it's really important to look at that. We also have a number of other episodes, one on high performing education with Claire Richmond on the podcast, and we really go through what high performing education for teams looks like. So we really dig into both high and medium fidelity simulation and how that enhances learning. Claire is a retrieval specialist, but she's also the director of education for Sydney Hems. Then we also look at a number of other podcasts, one really on how the UK HEMS model is different to the Franco-Germanic model and indeed the US model of HEMS. And that really is around how the UK HEMS model interacts and interfaces with the general public. So we're going to interview the LAA team, including the CEO, Jonathan Jenkins, as to how really it's important to both engage with the public, the messaging around the importance of HEMS systems, also the behind-the-scenes efforts to both bring helicopters into service, but also the challenges that charities face within the UK and the crucial role the public plays in supporting its mission. So do join us as we progress throughout this season. There's lots of varied content on the podcast. I'm also keen to get your feedback as to what worked well, what maybe didn't work as well, and what you'd like to hear more of on the podcast. I think we're also going to do a mini-series into 2025 on geriatric medicine and what that looks like within pre-hospital care. And we're also going to do a number of other mini-series, one also on medical legal aspects of care within pre-hospital care, as that's an extremely important topic to cover. Please do enjoy this episode with Lucy Gough on managing mental health on the front line and the trauma risk management tool, so the TRiM tool. Please feel free to rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and thanks again.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be speaking with Lucy Gough around supporting mental health on the front line. So in the conversation, we're going to examine the role of TRiM, so trauma risk management. So TRiM is a trauma-focused peer support system designed to assist individuals who've experienced traumatic or indeed potentially traumatic events. So it originated in the UK Armed Forces, and indeed TRiM is based on the principle of active monitoring, where trained non-medical personnel known as TRiM practitioners keep a watchful eye on those exposed to trauma. So these practitioners are not counsellors or therapists, but are trained to understand the effects of trauma, maintain confidentiality, and provide practical advice. So they are skilled in spotting signs of distress, conducting TRiM assessments, and planning meetings and directing individuals to appropriate care and support if needed. So to do this, I'm joined by Lucy Gough. Lucy is no stranger to the podcast. She's joined me before, previously to talk about her experiences through the pandemic as an emergency medical dispatcher. So Lucy is a senior link worker and indeed a trained TRiM practitioner, as well as an emergency medical dispatcher. So in the episode, we're going to explore Lucy's role within the Senior Link project, but also as a TRiM facilitator for EMS staff. We're going to discuss mental health challenges, support strategies, the implementation of TRiM after traumatic events, but we're also going to discuss the stigma around seeking help, some of the success stories Lucy's been privy to, and indeed the future of mental health support for frontline workers. Lucy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Owen. It's lovely to see you again.
It's great to have you back. Lucy, I just wondered if we could maybe just kick off actually by getting you to speak to and indeed unpack the role as a senior link worker. So what entails on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, so originally to get the role, it was a very thorough process. We had to go through interviews, and then we had training with a company called March on Stress. They did as a 2-day TRiM training. And then we did a residential 3-day course with Fatima Fernandez, who's the LAS psychotherapy. And we did the course, which was more bespoke to LAS TRiM training, shall we say. It's something I've always been interested in. I'm very much for my crews and for their safety and welfare and their mental well-being. And I've got so many friends that I've made friends through my relationships being a dispatcher. As the senior link worker, I'm a little bit unique in I'm the only senior link worker within both control rooms. There is one other, but she's a paramedic. So from an actual EOC control room point of view, I'm the only one, which I'm actually really proud of because it shows the type of person that I am and how I am for my crews and the staff in general. I'm a bit of a mum.
Well, we were just talking actually offline about just how it really helps you to see the other side of the job, actually, the other side of the role on the front line and relate to colleagues
Yeah.
and staff on the other side. Could I get you to speak to just your approach towards supporting mental health on the front line of EMS staff?
Yeah. So I'm very much for crews' mental health, very much for it. And after I did my TRiM training, I actually did a course through Gloucester College of it was a level 2 mental health and suicide awareness, which suicide and self-harm, sorry, which I felt has given me some really good tools to be able to help staff and assist them more in strategies of how to deal with things. But it's really funny, when I first started as a senior link worker and doing the TRiMs, I could tell by just speaking to somebody, by their voice, if there were long pauses, how they spoke. And some of the calls I've actually done via FaceTime or by WhatsApp video, because I found doing it away from a work environment, they could be themselves. And seeing that person face to face, even some of the men, break down, they were in tears. But for me, I got so much from that because they opened up and shared some really quite sort of dark thoughts and things. So it's it's quite a difficult topic, as you say,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to men with their mental health.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that actually, Lucy, because like you said, I think there is a lot of stigma, but also just a lot of especially men just don't reach out for help soon enough, and actually the tools and or the coping mechanisms that men employ just aren't working anymore, and it starts to
No.
bleed out. It can't help but bleed out of certain colleagues when
Mm.
there is significant mental health issues. Could I get you to speak to, and just something you said there, which is really powerful actually, which is it's about seeing a person, and
Mhm.
what the inference there I think is, Lucy, is that there's certain traits, non-verbal traits, or indeed non-verbal, or indeed just the tonality, the intonation that is very revealing actually
Mm.
about how the extent of which what someone's struggling
Totally.
with the anger, or just how
Yeah.
they're holding themselves, how their
Their
posture.
body, the body language gives away so much.
Yeah, yeah. If I wondered, could get you to speak to just some of the common challenges, mental health challenges that you see in the frontline staff in your experience.
I found a lot of people, especially the younger student paramedics, um, a lot of them suffer with anxiety. Um, and I don't know if this is part of the pandemic, because going back sort of 3, 4 years ago, the age that they were at, they've probably missed a lot of their sort of uni, college. And I feel that there's a lot of anxiety. Um, I feel with quite a few of the older ones, there's a lot of home life stress. Um, and I've always been a firm believer, if everything at work is good and things are not great at home, you can cope with that. If it's not great at home, but brilliant, vice versa, it's okay. But when both are not good, that's when, and I've noticed that quite a lot, that there seems to be home life and work life are not great. They attend a call that maybe 6 months ago hadn't wouldn't have triggered, but has brought a trigger of anxiety, um, dealing with mental health calls, the staff. I mean, I remember one girl I spoke to, she was telling me about a patient that was trying to sort of tie the seatbelt around his neck. And she said that she really struggled afterwards, having to witness that. Very
No,
hard.
yeah, indeed, and like you said, the pillars of, and this is kind of the unspoken, um, some of the unspoken principles of mental health is that, like you said, behind every practitioner, behind every clinician is hopefully, a well-rested clinician, so they've had some sleep because things
Mm.
fall apart super quick without good
Yeah,
sleep. Functioning relationships, so functioning marital or relational relationships, just in the background.
yeah,
Again, this completely unseen. There's lots of elements that need to be functioning perfectly well, or indeed at
totally.
some level to be able to care for other people. And this is the interplay whereby I think in the whole Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you haven't got the bases covered, it's super hard to extend beyond yourself and actually care
Totally.
for other people
Yeah.
when things aren't going well. And I guess my question on the back of that would be, what are some of the strategies you found? Because so we're going to look at the TRiM management as
Mhm.
this risk management shortly, but could I get you to speak to some of the effective tools that you use just to help frontline staff cope with cumulative stress?
So when I do a trim, obviously everything's confidential. And that's one of the first things that I get out, that is confidential. I will only ever speak to somebody if I've got concerns for their mental well-being. What we discuss is confidential to the degree that obviously they could tell me personal stuff, which sometimes comes out. And I say, we talk about the before, the during, the after of the call, and anything else that comes up in between. And I have found that midway through a trim, something will come up. There'll be something that's gone on at home There'll be something else that's happened at work. There'll be something that happened in the debrief of a call that again triggers. And I've actually found it, if you just listen, just listening. And Fatima has always taught me the pauses. Don't worry about the pause. And I've noticed this, if there's a 2, 3, maybe a 4-second pause, you can tell people are thinking and then they'll speak. So don't ever bridge the gaps like I would in a 999 call.
Listen, that's powerful, Lucy. And you just this principle of active listening.
Totally.
It's I think fundamentally paying attention to people and making them or allowing them to be heard. And
Yeah.
you're right as well. Sometimes the narrative of the story or indeed the struggles don't come out initially.
No.
Sometimes it's just you're right. It's the anecdotal, story from the job, but actually it's listening out for the really personal or indeed the real the the origin of the stress
Yeah.
and to the actual truth, as it manifests, as it comes out. But again, that could be at the start, middle, or end, or
Hmm.
indeed it could be second or third time they see you, because
Yeah.
sometimes these things just take time to
And they
come out.
build up a trust.
Yeah.
There's an element of trust. And I will always say to anybody that I do a TRiM for, we do a follow-up in about 4 to 6 weeks, which I know we'll touch on, and I say to them, if in that time you need anything and you don't want to speak to a manager, my phone is always on. If you get another call that you think, oh my goodness, that's going to be another TRiM referral, let me know and I'll take it on, because I believe in the continuity for the staff. Because, as I say, you can build up that rapport and trust.
Yeah, I think
And
trust is fundamental. It really is.
totally,
Absolutely. So
yeah.
let's go there, Lucy. Let's go. Let's dig into what TRiM is. So the trauma risk management.
Mhm.
For those unfamiliar, could you maybe just describe what TRiM is and indeed how it benefits frontline EMS staff?
TRiM stands for trauma risk management, and it's to look out for any signs, any risk factors from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, it's not always the most traumatic calls that crews can attend, as you touched on earlier. It can be someone's first cardiac arrest. Today, I've dealt with a couple of calls where it's been a burns patient, a new NQP, and felt totally out of control. Never been to a call like that before. Um, and it's just listening to them, talking about the before, the during, the after. And I try not to rush it through, let them speak. And sometimes I have to say, okay, so how did the call come down? And they'll tell me if they're driving, attending. But we've got new systems now, MDTs, NMAs, I think they're called, that if you drive over 7 miles an hour, you don't get any updates. So these crews can be driving to a call and they're not getting all the updates at once. So until they stop, and then all of a sudden they get loads of updates. So from a dispatcher point of view, I will call my crew and say to them, right, this is happening, that's happening. So they're mentally prepared. I also ask them if they speak to their crewmate on the way. What are they discussing? If it's a cardiac arrest, if it's a pediatric arrest, just to try and get to know how they're thinking while they're going. Um, and then midway through the TRiM is the sort of the during the call, try and find out what their role was within a call, because then you can sometimes get the APPs turn up, HEMS turn up. So the dynamics can change. And I have noticed that the APPs and HEMS have been amazing with these staff in their support. And right, I'm the one that's talking now. you listen to me, this is what we're going to do. And they can take that step back and tell everyone. So the crews really do help like that, because then they're in that mindset, they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Um,
It's helpful. Yeah.
totally. And they know what the plan of action is. And I think that's anyone within the emergency services. We like to know what's going to happen. We like a routine and a plan. And I think if you're off plan, it can all go totally wrong. So for these guys, it helps them. And then the afterwards, I make sure that they've had a debrief. And how was that debrief? Did they find it helpful? Was there anything they didn't find helpful? Because I think for a learning curve for whoever's doing the debriefs, whether it be HEMS, APPs, IROs, I would like to feel that I can then go to these IROs and say, do you know what? Did a TRiM. What a fantastic debrief you did. Or this was mentioned. And it's not to upset people, but let's all work together and, it's going to help them on their next call. And then the sort of the after the debrief, what do you do? Did you go back to station? Did you have welfare? Were you shown off the road? Did you have any problems being shown off the road? Did you go back out on e-calls? And it's really funny, actually, quite recently, some trims that I've done on pretty, I won't say high profile jobs that have been in the papers, that have been very much in the public eye. These crews have seen and dealt with, and I would never like to deal with it myself. And they said, we can't go back out because I don't think I've got it in me to not get frustrated. And I said, what do you mean by that? Is that your 3-week-old chest pain, or you're somebody with your stub toe? And they said, totally that, because they don't feel they can have that empathy to carry that through to the next patient, because is burnt out the right way? They're just mentally and physically exhausted from that big call.
Yeah, no, indeed. So, a couple more questions on the back of that, actually, just Lucy, but a couple of things just for an international listenership. APP is
Mhm.
Advanced Paramedic Practitioner.
Sorry, yeah.
No, yeah, indeed. No, and IRO is Incident Response Officer. And
Right.
what these people do is come to the more sort of acute care jobs or
Yeah.
indeed incidents in London, but also across the UK as
Yeah.
the role is mapped out. So that's what that stands for. But so my question would be on the back of that, Lucy, because there's a lot of really interesting things you mentioned there. Do you probe um, people for the personal information, as in how are functional relationships at home? Or do you just let that come out? How do you approach that?
I see how things go. So when we've done the debrief and we've gone back to station, I said, okay, when you went home, how were things? Did you manage to sleep okay? Did you manage to eat? If you don't mind me asking, do you live at home with your parents? Are you alone? Are you in a house share? So that also then gives me a good gauge of um, if they're in a house share with other paramedics. I think, well, that's brilliant, because they can then support them. They understand everything. Um, I had one recently whose partner used to say to her when she came home, how was your day? And if she said, no, I had a really bad day. Okay, is there anything I can do for you? And she say, no, let's just go for a walk. Let's take the dog for a walk. And that was her way of de-stressing. But she felt she was protecting her partner from what she'd seen, which I get that and I understand that, because some things, and as you know, Owen, we see some really horrible things that you wouldn't wish upon anybody. So they do try, some of them, as more the females, they try to protect their partners, I've noticed.
And to your point, Lucy, I think this is almost because there is an element of this almost listening therapy involved in this,
Hmm.
where, like I said, that you're helping a clinician or indeed just member of staff process. We, as a colleague of ours, Carl Betts would say, just put it into the mental filing cabinet in an orderly fashion so that you can gain a more healthy perspective, really, and but
Yeah,
also understand because especially, and I speak to my own experience here, you sometimes you're so close to an issue that you don't realize all the external stresses and pressures that you're dealing with, that you're too close to it. And
yeah,
so it is that kind of that element of self-reflection vicariously through someone
yeah.
else, that you can just be stand back and see things for what they actually are.
Mm,
So in providing extra support, Lucy,
yeah.
what's the adjunctive? So say someone is having real problems, either
Hmm.
processing or, like say, manifesting early stages of PTSD, be that anger, be that re-experiencing a traumatic event,
Hmm.
or the main facets of PTSD. What are the referral pathways, or indeed extension, um, that you have in your toolkit? What would you recommend?
Okay, so I should have touched on this at the beginning. We don't contact anyone within the first 48 to 72 hours because that's the time that they need to process things. And I often say to the crews or the people that I'm speaking to, you probably went through that call forwards, backwards, backwards, forwards, inside out, everything. And they're like, oh my God, yes, I did. And I said, but that is normal. Okay. So then they sort of relax a little bit because they think, actually, that's normal. That's okay. I'm okay to have done that. So I do the risk factor questions, which I know we're going to touch on. If they're scoring if they get a high score of 10 or over, that to us is there could be a risk that this person may need some follow up after because we do a follow up 4 to 6 weeks later. Now, what I tend to do is, and I can't tell you how I do it, but I judge it by speaking to that person that if they're really struggling, I will say to them, right, I'm going to text you next week, next Monday. I give them a day and I make sure I stick to it and it's in my diary because you know what we're like, we're sticklers for keeping to plan. And I'll drop you a text just to check in, just to see how you're doing. But I need you to be honest with me. And if you're struggling, you either text me before that week's out or you give me a call. And because I've got them, then they will say, yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. And a few recently dropped them the text, how's things? Well, do you know, since we last spoke, yeah, I've been able to do a little bit more. And I keep note of everything. I have a book, which is my Bible. Um, and then if things are still not great, I will speak to Fatima Fernandez, who's the psychotherapy. She's the service mental health lead, and I will tell her what's happened, what I've done, what we've spoken about, and then she will say, "Well, did you touch on about any form of trauma counselling?" Which I can do that. I can arrange trauma counselling if I feel, oh, and there's been members of staff that I've done an initial TRiM on, and I know straight away they need some more help. Don't ask me how I know it. I think it's because of how what they feed to me, and I can just sense it in their voice. As you said earlier, their facial expressions, their body language, I can just tell. So I can straight away, I can just put that straight into Fatima and she will get them referred within 24, 48 hours.
Which is excellent, really, Lucy, because, like you said, the TRiM is almost this initial assessment, which is repeated over time. But
Hmm.
fundamentally, it's this building of trust so things can come out. But it addresses, like you said, low level, and we'll go there in a second, actually, just about the risk, about how you
Hmm.
score,
Yeah,
and the matrix, because, like you said, it no two people are the same, no two people have got the same conditions, and
no.
Moving to a different country, having no support mechanism around you, having probably a handful of friends which are all on rotating shifts, so they're not in the immediate vicinity. You
Mm,
feel isolated. You haven't got all the support or any of the support mechanisms
no,
around you, and actually. It's so easy in that place to actually really struggle and actually
totally.
not
Yeah,
have not have anything or anyone to really process things with.
no. And do you know that's really quite interesting because we have a lot of Australians within the service. And I sort of always ask them where they're from, how long have they been over here, what's their living arrangements. Um, and I sort of throw in that my son was in Australia a few years ago, and I say to them where he was, and that then again you can sort of hear, oh, hang on a minute, this person knows a little bit about Australia, and they sort of, I want to say relax a bit, but yes, relax to a certain degree. Again, that's another little element of trust. And I say to them, I appreciate your support network here isn't great because of the time differences, etc. Do you speak to your family a lot? And because technology is so great now, FaceTime, WhatsApp, all that, they do. And I think it's a lot better. Um, but I will also speak to my colleagues that I know that are Australian, and I know a few that are on the road. And if I think someone's really sort of struggling, I will have a chat with them and say to them, right, what do I need to do? Is there anything, to try and get ideas for me to put to that person that is from not from England?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and it
Yeah.
does help, certainly
Yeah.
does help.
Yeah, and like you said, it builds trust, but it also is a listening ear, and just it can help not only just clarify, but just really realign people's perspectives on
Yeah.
things. So, Lucy, just run us through the risk scoring matrix, or just what someone who would score quite low, and indeed someone who could score quite high. Just run us
Mhm.
through to give listeners some kind of mental model about the actual scoring itself.
Okay, so at the initial trim, we go through 10 questions, which I don't have a copy of in front of me, unfortunately. Sorry. Um, and the scoring is 0 is for not present, 1 is partially present, and 2 is definitely present. And there are questions on there. Do you think you had little or no control over your behavior reactions during the call? And you can hear the cogs, the turning, because they're thinking, well, did I have control? Did I not have control? Um, Also, there's one, have you experienced acute stress since the call? Another question is about work, life, home stressors. Has anything happened since the call that could sort of obviously trigger things? Um, Social support. Do they have social support? Are they having trouble with their day-to-day activities? So you could find that somebody that used to do a lot of running, cycling, those will stop, which is obviously a bit of a concern. That's another one. And sometimes in the conversations, they'll say something and they'll say, yeah, I didn't go for my run today. I didn't go yesterday either, but I'll keep a note of that so that I'll know when the questions. And then the last one is, have they been drinking alcohol excessively or taking any prescription drugs to cope with their distress? Now, some will automatically say, no, nothing at all. Others will say, oh God, I went to a party last week and I did have a bit of a de-stress. Does that count? That doesn't count. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm honest. It's if you're drinking every day of the week that we need to, that's the worry. Oh, no, 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 no. I just went to this party last weekend. So it's sort of in a bit of a light way, but there have been others that have said, actually, Lucy, yeah, I found I've got home from work. I've had to have a couple of glasses of wine or I've had to have a couple of drinks. And that again, definitely present, that's another risk factor. So at the end of those 10 questions, we add it up. If the score is over 10, then I know that we need to keep an eye on this person. And I will tell them that I've got concerns for them, because why hide it? If I've got to be open with them as they're open with me, and if I've got a concern, I tell them.
And I think that's appropriate and reasonable, actually, Lucy, because as you said, actually, they need to know um, where they are as a baseline as well. And actually, just to realign
Mhm,
their expectations of what they probably need going forward, which is more consultations, which is probably a referral, and which is probably an escalation
mhm,
of care, albeit counseling or therapy.
mhm.
But you're right, it builds trust, to be honest, but also gives them, yeah, a baseline of understanding,
Yeah.
which is key. Something I'd like to get your perspective on. We're going to look at a good news story, or indeed an example where TRiM has worked really well. But before we
Mhm,
do, I'd just like to get your thoughts on one of my reflections and revelations, really, about the advanced paramedic role, or indeed just pre-hospital care in general, is that
mhm,
a lot of it is palliative. And what I mean by that is sometimes, irrespective of what you do, certainly in critical care, sometimes you get to shape the trajectory of care and the outcome of the patient. But a lot of times it's heading in one direction, irrespective of what you do. And
yeah.
sometimes I've definitely had to lead debriefs and talk to crews and maybe talk to some younger paramedics
Mhm,
and EMS staff that bear the guilt of, and sometimes when I wasn't even there, we do a retrospective debrief for a call that they didn't have critical care there
yeah.
for, but that feel the burden of responsibility and of guilt that someone died on the way to hospital, or irrespective of what they did. And
Mhm,
we'll go through the ceilings of care and what they did on scene, and it's abundantly apparent to me that this was written in time. This was the trajectory of care. This was what was going to happen, irrespective
mhm.
of, and it's
Yeah.
almost having coming to peace with that. Now, part of that, as quite rightly as you say, is about listening and listening to the clinician
Mhm,
and helping them process that. But I had the revelation quite early on that a lot of pre-hospital care is palliative, and it's not, you can't make a difference even in that, because you can
no.
not in a non-fatalistic way. You can, even the words you express to the team and to the relatives can still make a difference and still ease the pain,
Mhm,
ease suffering. But there is this palliative nature to pre-hospital care, which I tended to find younger staff struggled with more so, because maybe their expectations or their training had kind of guided them down a path that if you do this, if you do X, then Y happens. And
mhm.
that's not life. That's not how
No,
life happens.
no. And I think doing the job that we do, all of us, and I say this to people that I do the trims on, is our job is to fix people. That's what we're there for, isn't it? And cardiac arrests are what we would say are our bread and butter calls. You go in, you know exactly what to do. Whereas you get these calls that are palliative, and it is very sad. Um, and they can't quite grasp, why couldn't we fix that person? And that again is when debriefs are really helpful. Um, just to on this, I've had a lot of maternity calls. So we've had quite a few stillborns. We had somebody that had a stillborn at 19 weeks and had a catastrophic bleed, and this crew had no support barring each other. And I've actually found, because we have a maternity team within the service, and I will speak to Fatima first and say to her, look, I've had this done this TRiM. What do you think? Shall I get in touch with the maternity team? And she, spot on. So I will email the maternity team and explain the call, and that the crew would benefit from a debrief, because I think maternity is one of those ones you're not going to have a midwife with you all the time to support you. And they do amazing because they will get together with the crew. I mean, this crew that had the fetus that was stillborn and a catastrophic bleed, they had anybody, I think they said there was about 8 people there, and they went through literally like the TRiM, the before, the during, the after the call, the care at the hospital. And that is I think that's a massive tool for me to be able to use, that I can go to these people to get support that I can't give them the answers that they need. Whereas they've come to terms with, okay, it's really sad, but this didn't work, that didn't, why did this happen? And I can't answer that. Unfortunately, I'm not medically trained to be able to do it. So, but to have those tools there, and even like the APPs, the advanced paramedics, I can speak to them and get some answers. And then I can go back to these people and say, do you know what? I've had a chat with the APP and da 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 da. And they're like, oh my God, okay, yeah, thank. But again, that's a little bit of closure for them because that's answering their questions that they might not want to ask somebody. Whereas me, I'm straight in and I'll ask.
And
Because if you don't ask, you don't know, do you?
exactly, Lucy, exactly. And just to articulate the elephant in the room, we interviewed 3 consultant paramedics on the podcast, and we've got some more maternity episodes coming up actually. And
Hmm.
one of the things that they articulate, and you've just very much touched on this, Lucy, is around the absence or just the the um the absence of training. Just there's not as much training, or indeed the longevity of training is quite minimal
Yeah.
so these acute
Hmm.
maternity calls or incidents. You know, in hospital you'll have a neonatologist, you'll have a midwives, you'll have obstetricians, you'll have
Hmm.
you know, the ED consultant right there. You know, multi MDT, multidisciplinary team right
Yeah.
there, and it's not the case in principal care. And you may these some of these clinicians have had a day's training, a week's training. Yeah, and
Mm.
that itself can be a real risk factor for PTSD because, like you
Yeah.
said, you don't feel almost equipped or trained. And certainly myself, that was one of my real. I would always get nervous
Yeah.
about critical care
Hmm.
maternity jobs because, like you said,
Yeah.
there's 2 lives at stake. Sometimes it is just fundamentally palliative. These
Yeah.
stillborn, there's nothing you can do about that, and
No.
so it's these are really difficult incidents, which
Yeah.
you're right, we have minimal training for, and
Hmm.
therefore sometimes we don't have the mental toolkit to understand that we were never going to change the outcome.
No, exactly. And I think I mean, there's one call that always sticks in my head, that I did a trim for the crew, and one of them, we did the trim. She cried her eyes out, bless her heart. Absolutely. And the really lovely thing was, as we were talking and she was crying, her cat walked behind her and sat behind her as if to say, it's okay, I'm here. Which was very soothing for me to see, you know, because obviously the cat's showing concern for the owner, but her colleague didn't take up the trim, but they'd been texting. And she said, I really don't think they're having a good time, da da da. So I reached out to them. And do you know what? I caught it just in time because
Yeah.
his manager had also messaged Fatima his concerns for his welfare, his mental well-being. And she said to me, Lucy, you were spot on because you caught him just in time.
Oh, that's
Um,
almost the good news story that I was after, actually, because and it's funny that you articulate it was a male because
mhm.
they often are. I think there's
Yeah.
on certain scales, being a male scores an extra point on risk
Mhm.
factors
Yeah.
because there is a real absence of either self-care or just ability to reach out or feeling the ability to reach out.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And do you know the really I can still picture when I spoke to him, when I did the trim, how he was sitting. and he was saying things to me because he'd previously been in the army, so he'd had PTSD. He knew the triggers, he knew his coping mechanisms. His mum is a retired midwife, so he'd spoken to his mum, and still, after all those things, it wasn't working. So straight away, I knew that he needed instant support, and got on it straight away. And I think Fatima knows now with me that if I contact her about a member of staff, it's because I am really concerned, and she knows. I think
Yeah.
she's got the trust in me to do, that I know that something's not right.
So, Lucy, looking at the future of link workers and indeed
Hmm.
TRiM, and just the evolution of the role, really, because I think to your point, just what you've just said there, it is a super important function and role, not only because you fundamentally enjoy the role as well, it kind of gives
Hmm.
back to you, but also it
Hmm.
catches these people.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like you said, even when they don't reach out for help, but they need to be approached just to
Hmm.
try and debrief and contextualize and unpack. Um, so it is such and it's almost like a point, the first point of contact, or the initial point of contact to
Yeah.
catch these people, and to reach out and get help. Could you maybe speak to where you see the future of the role heading to sort of almost increase this almost sieve and funnel to try and
Hmm.
catch and support people's mental health?
So within the service that I work for, London Ambulance Service, we have 10 senior link workers. Now, if you think we cover 620 square miles of London, how many ambulance stations that we have, and how many crews and call takers, we're talking quite a few thousand members of staff. And we take what, 6,000 calls a day within a 24-hour period. I'm not saying every one of those is going to be a traumatic or a concern, but we get TRiMs daily, and we have a WhatsApp message, a team WhatsApp group, and they'll put in, right, I've got 35 TRiMs that need doing. And it's like, oh, that's quite a lot. Now I take them and I'm straight away and I get in contact. I'm very much, right, this needs to be done. I can't hold on to it for a few days. I know other service, I think CCAM, Southeast Coast, they have taken on permanent TRiM practitioners, which I think for London, it would be a good thing to do, because I think, because this is all voluntary, Owen, I and all the time that I spend is my own time. Admitted, it's the crew's time as well, their own time, but I love it that much that I will do it in my own time. Now, if somebody came to me tomorrow and said to me, "Oh, we're bringing out a TRiM practitioner job," straight away, I would go for it, because that's something I feel I get a lot from the
Absolutely, and I think Lucy as well. I think other people benefit from that as well because, like you said,
yeah.
it's um it's anthropology. All that means is, I guess, is you study people and you learn the red flags, and
Hmm.
the late famous Peter Drucker said it's learning what's not been said in the room. It's learning
Yeah.
what's not been said verbally, which
Hmm.
actually sometimes is the biggest signal. And
Yeah.
you're right, it's the intonation, it's the tonality, it's how people are holding themselves, it, it's their temperament, it's their ability to
Hmm.
form coherence and sentence structure. So there's lots of things actually, and build that quick trust,
Yes,
because
definitely.
without that, you're not going to get to the heart of
Because
the issue.
the barrier will be there, and you will not break down that barrier no matter how hard you try. Um, there was an instance, it was a couple of years ago now actually, that I did a TRiM on a guy that had attended a call. Um, Patient unfortunately was deceased. It was an RTC, road traffic collision, and he was the only one that ended up attending. because there was nothing we could do for them, sadly. And I spoke to him a couple of hours after the call, and I said to him, "Look, I'm a senior link worker. If you need anything, da 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 da." I had a chat. He said, "I don't remember driving back from the scene to the station." And I'm thinking, that not good. So I called ahead to his manager, who I know very well through because they did HEMS and they're also now a clinical team manager. And I phoned them through and I said, "Look, you need to keep an eye on this guy. Cup of tea ready, make sure he's had something to eat because I don't think he's eaten." And I did his TRiM and everything was all fine. And then it must have been about a year later, because this is a bit of a good story as such, but about a year later, sadly, he lost his mum. And he was her sort of caregiver and what have you. And the service offered, do you want any counselling, etc. And he said, "No." He said, "But do you know what? I spoke to Lucy Gough," he said, "when she did my TRiM." He said, "And I felt I got a lot from our conversation." So the member of staff said, "Okay, I'll give her a shout and see." So I did a weekly hour session chat with this person, and I probably for 2 months, again in my own time, we picked a time and a date, and we did it via FaceTime, and we talked about everything you can imagine, everything. But again, from the bereavement point of view, and we were able to talk about things about his mum and her ways, and he was able to share that with me, which I find really powerful that he could share that with me. Because again, it's a trust issue, isn't it? That he's obviously built the trust, and yeah, so that's
But
that's one of
why?
the good
Yeah, good
ones.
news stories. Yeah, which is
Yeah.
which is really important actually, Lucy, because like you said, I think the pivot and what we're realizing this as a profession is more so around caring for the carers because
Hmm.
if who is caring for our frontline staff if there isn't a number of people in the background, because sometimes you lose the ability to self-care when,
Hmm.
as we said before, your support mechanism is 5,000, 10,000 miles away at the other side of the
Hmm.
world. If you've stopped sleeping properly, your relationship with the significant other isn't working properly,
Hmm.
and just the ability to self-care isn't there. Therefore, the ability to care for others and as an extension, i.e., your
Hmm.
full-time job, is starting to fall over, and
Yeah.
things can unravel. And so
Yeah.
this pivot of caring for carers, and to your earlier point around having full-time TRiM practitioners, I think
Hmm.
you're right. You only have to do the numbers. The 6,000 call incidents a day,
Hmm.
repeating over time. Just in that the numbers, there is there's a certain number of those incidents which are going to be traumatic,
Yeah.
irrespective. And that's why we have the critical care card array, or indeed
Yeah.
the HEMS or whatever. It is so necessary to have this service and
Hmm.
to provide, like you said, a listening ear, but just this
Hmm.
just someone, community, just an impartial community
Yeah.
that can guide, that can signpost, that can escalate care if needed,
Hmm.
or just
It's a,
say you're going to be
as you
okay.
said, sorry, it's a peer-to-peer network.
Yeah,
So they know they're going to be speaking to somebody from the service that sort of, shall we say, gets it.
gets it.
And I know a lot of the other senior link workers, they're all road staff
Yeah,
and they really do get it. Um, but I think because I've done 18 years now within the service, my experience that I've gained sitting next to people like yourself in the control room, it's quite amazing how much information you do sort of retain. It's quite a valuable tool, you people. You don't realize how good you are, and I think as a dispatcher, I'm very, very aware that I can be looking after, if I've got the central sector of London, up to 60 resources. So if you think, say, 40 of those are ambulances, that's 80 members of staff. that I'm responsible for, because if I don't look out for them, because I'm their first point of call, who will look out for them? And that's where things can get lost and people can drop to the wayside because they're not being, say, looked after, but looked out for, shall we say.
So listen, Lucy, as we come into land on the conversation, mindful of time, could you maybe speak to a few take-home messages for listeners just around, we've covered a lot of ground actually, but I'm really interested in people that are either interested in the TRiM practitioner role, but also people that might be struggling and might think, actually, maybe that's me. Maybe I do need to speak to someone. Could you maybe speak to just a few take-home messages, just to reassure staff that there is people out there willing to listen?
My first thing would be to say is it's okay not to be okay. And don't ever be afraid to ask for help, because there will be somebody there. I should have said earlier, actually, from the senior link work point of view, we have a 24-hour line that is manned by members of staff like myself. We do that for a whole week. And there are times that phone will ring at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, where they felt brave enough to ring. And I think it is having that braveness to be able to say, actually, do you know what? I do need to speak to somebody. And you get somebody like myself and others that, understand and can share the empathy and support and guide. So don't ever be afraid. Please don't ever be afraid to ask for help.
I think that's pivotal, Lucy. I think that's the jumping off point to all these services really. And just speaking to colleagues in the past, they say they don't realize how much they needed it but once they've been through talking to someone,
Yeah.
that was the revelation. They were like, gosh, I need this, I needed that. And actually this just offloading and just sharing the burden, sharing the load. It was absolutely the decision maker, and indeed the changed everything for them.
Yeah. And I've had quite a lot of text messages from staff that I've done trims for, maybe 24, 48 hours later, and they text me and they say, thank you so much for the time you took to talk to me, because it's really helped me and it's made me look at things differently and look at things in an open light. And yeah, it does help,
It's
really does.
powerful. It's powerful.
Yeah.
Listen, Lucy, thank you for your time today. It's really great just to get your perspectives and thoughts and insights. What we'll do in the show notes is we'll put information on TRiM, so
Yeah.
trauma risk management. Will so people can go away and just research it a little bit more,
Yeah.
and just find out. But listen, thank you so much.
No worries, Owen. It's been lovely to catch up.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.